She had learned, the hard way, that some doors closed not because the world disliked her, but because it did not know how to hold what she carried. She'd been praised for her courage once, then later quietly set aside like a book no one meant to read again. She used to believe hope was a straightforward thing. Ask, receive, move on. After the rejection, hope felt fragile, like the spine of a paperback that had been bent open one too many times. Sophie Bennett's hands trembled as she smoothed the edge of the intake form. The clinic smelled the way clinics always did, a crisp, faintly chemical cleanliness that tried to be comforting and only reminded you of things that could go wrong. Her fingers left crescent moons in the paper. The receptionist's chair hummed with a low, polite energy. A woman 2 seats away scrolled through her phone, indifferent. The clock over the receptionist's head went on moving, merciless and ordinary. This time, Sophie had made herself come. She worked afternoons at a tiny used bookstore 2 blocks from the clinic. Dust motes and the soft thud of pages turned were the only steady things left. The rejection she carried was not spoken of in neat sentences. She never had to say the word for it. People either heard it in her pauses or they didn't hear it at all. Once, at a dinner where someone had asked why she never brought a date, someone else had joked, and the laughter had folded around her like a wind that pushed her back. She remembered the polite retreat of voices, the way the man across from her had, with ridiculous tenderness, said, "It's okay." That had been the softest kind of rejection, an attempt at consolation that was really a tally of what he could not bear. She had learned to rehearse answers that didn't sound like defeat. She had learned to make herself small in public so she wouldn't take up anyone's pity. She built her life around that smallness. Tidy shifts at the shop, early walks down the river, short, safe friendships that required minimal revealing. The clinic appointment was the latest compromise, necessary and therefore unavoidable. But necessity felt like shame in a sterile waiting room. When Dr. Daniel Hayes entered the exam area, the air rearranged itself around him like a subtle current. He wore the clean, quiet confidence of someone who could be relied upon. A black coat, a slim folder clutched with a practiced, unhurried grip. His presence was not dramatic. It was just precise. He smiled, and it was a small thing, no grand charm, more an ease that lived just under his skin. "Miss Bennett," he said, stepping into the doorway. His voice was low, calm. Sophie's throat closed. She stood because she had to, despite the urge to melt back into the chair and become part of the upholstery. Up close, his eyes were the color of late afternoon sky, cool, attentive. He offered his hand, a professional extension, brief and steady. The palm was warm. "Hi," she managed. Her own voice sounded odd to her, thin, as if wrapped around glass. He guided her into the exam room with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making strangers feel less exposed. "I'll be with you the whole time," he said, and it was exactly the sort of thing one said. Sophie clutched at the promise as if it were a lifeline. Dr. Hayes had a way of listening that made words feel useful again. He didn't finish her sentences. He didn't look away when she struggled for phrasing. When she confessed things that she had boxed up because she feared them becoming trophies of her fragility, he took them without comment and folded them back into the conversation with the careful hands of someone handling glass. There was, inevitably, a quiet chemistry, an electricity small enough to be almost maladaptive given the circumstances, but vivid nonetheless. Sophie noticed it in the way his movements slowed when he approached her, in the considerate distance he kept, as if he were aware of the line between physician and patient. There was no flirtation, not really. There were only gestures of human kindness that felt dangerous because they touched parts of her she had kept barricaded. The appointment ended with a printed sheet, a next steps list with administrative language that couldn't hold the things the two of them had not said. Sophie dithered at the door. "Thank you," she said, like someone giving change. Daniel watched her with a professional warmth. "Take care," he replied. She left the clinic with her chest tight. The city outside had its usual distractions, taxi horns, a woman juggling a stroller and a grocery bag, but Sophie's head was elsewhere. On the pavement, she could still feel the echo of the way his hand had brushed the folder closed. A trivial thing to anyone else. To her, a small earthquake. Back at the bookstore, Sophie lost herself among rows of spines. She let her fingers glide over paperbacks like a ritual, a recentering. But the memory of his voice made the afternoon light feel different. She popped the kettle on for the little shop stove and watched the steam lift. The shelf markings blurred as if she were underwater. A customer asked for a recommendation. She pulled a classic without thinking, smiling as if she were not unmoored. He found her before she expected it. It was not like in novels, no dramatic confrontation, no staged music on the street. He was in the aisle with the cookbooks when she turned around, a paperback in his hand. He had come in like a careful breeze, keeping at a polite distance. He smiled with the sort of humility that was practiced, and Sophie's first instinct was to tuck away the fluttering thing inside her like contraband. "Hi," he said, and she realized he had remembered that she worked there. He asked, casually, about a title she had recommended earlier in the week. The conversation moved with the small, warm steps of strangers learning to be acquaintances. He paid attention without insinuation. He asked about her shift. Sophie kept the answer short. She had learned to contain herself. Yet containment has its limits. She found herself laughing at something he said, soft, almost surprised laughter, and the sound startled her into remembering that she could be seen without being catalogued as broken. That was fragile and terrifying. Later that night, Sophie sank onto her small couch and typed his name into the search bar, more from nervous curiosity than desire for anything concrete. A glossy profile came up, an interview, a photograph of him in a suit at a philanthropic gala. The words Hayes Women's Health, founder, and donor to community programs haloed his name. He lived further up a social ladder than she had let herself imagine. The magazine photograph showed him in a dark suit, laughing with a woman at his side. Picture perfect, untouchable. She closed the laptop suddenly, nauseous at how quickly insecurity could rewrite a simple interaction. Money was not love. She knew that rationally. But in the quiet spaces where fear lived, wealth was a translating lens. He could buy services, experiences, respect that she had to inventory and stretch. She imagined being somewhere too small beside him. She imagined the pitying looks she had fled. The idea that he could be interested, or that anyone with options would choose to be with someone like her, felt preposterous. She avoided him after that. She skipped a weekend shift at the shop where they might cross paths. She missed an appointment she had scheduled, and then another. The silence between their occasional encounters widened into a canyon made of her own assumptions. In the shop, Sophie watched couples walk by, traded smiles with regulars, and kept her throat closed. The city carried on with a ruthless indifference, but to Sophie, every unreturned glance felt like a verdict. Daniel noticed in small ways. He sent a succinct clinical message through the clinic portal asking if she was okay, which felt professional and unthreatening. He left a message through a mutual acquaintance, a non-intrusive question about a recommended book. His gestures were measured, nowhere near the stalkerish persistence that haunts romances. They were careful attempts to remain present without encroaching. But any presence is pressure when someone is practicing being unseen. Time should have taught Sophie that people were not absolute, that affections could arise in odd places. But her history lived in her like a map of scars. She equated receiving care with owing something, and she equated owing with a loss of self. The idea that a wealthy, white-collar man might be interested in her in any tender, sincere way felt like an equation she didn't know how to balance. One evening, trudging home from a late shift, she felt a pressure across her chest that was not panic and not exactly pain, a fog that folded her knees inward. She steadied herself against a lamppost, breathing shallowly. She'd felt fatigue before, a constant companion now, but this was different. The world tilted, a bad perspective on a page, edges too bright. Someone in passing called out, worry skipping in their voice. Sophie thought, for a second, about finding a bench and sleeping, about letting the night swallow her whole. She lost consciousness before she could make any decisions. The last coherent thought before darkness was the absurd image of being small on the pavement, a paperback left open like a bird. Paramedics moved with the efficient choreography of people trained in triage. There was light, voices, the distant, muffled sound of the city like a radio station you couldn't quite tune. Later, in sterile brightness and the quiet beeping of monitors, Sophie woke with cotton in her mouth and a bright ring of hospital light. Dr. Daniel Hayes was at the foot of her bed when her eyes opened. She blinked at him, disoriented. In any other context, his presence might have felt like providence. Here, it felt complicated, impossibly complicated. He was not wearing a coat this time, or if he was, it had been shuffled to a chair. The clinical distance was shorter, the folder absent. He looked suddenly and distinctly like someone caught out of role. "Sophie," he said, voice both professional and fractured, "you're awake." She turned her head slowly, the hospital sheet a pale sail around her. The fluorescent lights made the world flat. For a beat she thought of pleading, of asking for simple assurances. Instead, the air was full of small noises, the ticking of a wall clock, footsteps in the hallway, the quiet shuffle of nurses. Daniel's face had softened in a way that was surprising, softened and raw. "What happened?" she whispered. "You collapsed," he answered. The sentence was factual, but it carried much more. "You were found on the sidewalk. Paramedics brought you in. You're stable." He paused, as if measuring how much to give. "I stayed." There it was, the line. He had stayed. He was not supposed to, not as her doctor outside the clinic. The thought was a kind of shock that made her stomach lurch with the knowledge of the implications. It was one thing for him to be kind in a clinic consultation, another thing altogether for him to bridge a professional boundary without negotiation. For a brief moment, Sophie wanted to push him away, not because he had been gentle, but because the gentleness carried weight she was not ready to shoulder. She imagined gratitude as a debt collector. She imagined him as someone with resources, with options, who could have stayed away and had a life of appointments and champagne. Here, in a fluorescent hospital room, his presence felt like a claim laid bare. Daniel's hands were steady as he reached for the chart beside the bed. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I'll be right outside if you need me." I lingered long enough for the world to notice, long enough for the nurse to look into the room, and for a subtle shift to happen in Sophie's chest. There was a tremor of something in his gaze that suggested more than duty, an ache, a private history she could almost, but not quite, read. When the nurse left and the hall voice receded, Daniel did something he almost never did in clinical settings. He let himself be unprofessional in the smallest way, letting a personal sentence slip into the sterile air. "I was afraid, seeing you on the sidewalk," he said, each word deliberate. "I didn't want it to be anything worse." It was an admission, not a grand one. There was no theatrical confession about impossibly forbidden love. There was a man saying what was true in a moment of fear. He looked down at his hands, like someone embarrassed by the steadiness in them. "I've had losses," he added, in a hurried line that suggested a map of past betrayals. "It makes me careful in some ways, and in others, reckless." Sophie stared at him. "You're my doctor." He nodded, yes. The answer was small and an honest thing, a confession acknowledging the sacred awkwardness. The room seemed to gather itself around that admission, like rain funneling into gutters. The ethics of the moment were not dramatic, they were quietly perfectible. Daniel had crossed a line by being present outside an appointment, by letting his personal concern carry him into her life without the formalities their roles demanded. But the story he told with his next actions made the difference between a reckless breach and a man attempting to be accountable. "I crossed a line," he said, plain and immediate. "I shouldn't have stayed without a plan. That's on me." For a second, Sophie thought he would say nothing and they would both pretend the line had never been crossed. Instead, he reached for the phone and tapped a number with clinical efficiency. He spoke with the clinic's intake administrator in a voice that was precise and quiet. Sophie couldn't hear every word, but she heard transfer of care, immediate referral, and, most importantly, "I'll sign the notes and remove myself." He arranged for another physician to take over, gave specific directions that the administrative staff would follow, and then put the phone down with a small, tired sigh. "You didn't have to do that," Sophie said, the words a whisper. He shook his head as if to clear it. "I did. I don't want you ever to feel like I used my position to be in your life. That's unethical, and I'm sorry." There was no theatrical contrition. It was practical and careful, like a man who'd thought through the consequences before answering the impulse that had drawn him there. "You crossed the line," she said, not accusing him so much as recording fact. "And then you tried to fix it." He gave a short, almost rueful laugh. "Yes. Fixing doesn't erase the crossing. I know." He paused, and the hospital's fluorescent hum felt suddenly intrusive. "But I also don't want to walk away and pretend I was just being professional. That would be dishonest." There it was, an honesty that did not erase the power dynamics, but acknowledged them. He had not excused himself by saying he couldn't help how he felt. He had not attempted to romanticize his presence. Instead, he had chosen to stop being the person who could make decisions about her care while also making decisions about whether to pursue anything personal. He had made a record, he had arranged a transfer, and he was offering Sophie a choice. Sophie watched him with eyes that had been built on a lifetime of tentative settlements. "Why did you come?" she asked, because she needed the plain truth, the one without theatrics. He looked at her with an expression that made the hospital bed feel like common ground between two fragile things. He had not excused himself by saying he couldn't help how he felt. He had not attempted to romanticize his presence. Instead, he had chosen to stop being the person who could make decisions about her care while also making decisions about whether to pursue anything personal. He had made a record, he had arranged a transfer, and he was offering Sophie a choice. Sophie watched him with eyes that had been built on a lifetime of tentative settlements. "Why did you come?" she asked, because she needed the plain truth, the one without theatrics. He looked at her with an expression that made the hospital bed feel like common ground between two fragile things. "Because I thought you might need someone to notice when you weren't okay," he said simply. "That's not an excuse, that's the truth." She digested the sentence as she would an unfamiliar book. It didn't tell the whole story, it simply offered a piece. "I don't want to be someone's charity," she murmured. The words had been spoken before in slightly different contexts, by men who wanted to pity her or by friends who wanted to fix her. This time, however, they landed between her and a man who had just transferred her care. "It won't be that," he promised. "You have agency here, Sophie. I'm trying to respect it." The earnestness in his voice was not lightweight. If you want me to step back entirely, I will. If you want to talk, we can do that, but only after you're under another doctor's care and you say it's okay." She felt the power in those choices. He could have left with the quiet ego of a man who believed his pity was moral. He could have insisted. Instead, he had signaled the possibility of a relationship that would begin only after he had removed the professional lever from the equation. It was not a perfect solution. It could not erase the initial crossing, but it was a deliberate remedy. Sophie's throat tightened around more than just breath. "I don't know what I want," she said, because it was true. Her uncertainty was not weakness. It was the shape of someone who had to be careful about being owned, even by kindness. "You don't have to decide now," Daniel replied. "No pressure." He sat a little farther from the bedside, as if respecting an invisible perimeter. Up close, she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the small fatigue in his shoulders. He was younger than the magazine photos might have suggested by reputation, older in ways that counted. A nurse came in to change her dressing, professional and brisk. The paperwork was filled out, signatures made. At some point, between the mechanical movements, the formal transfer was logged. Dr. Hayes withdrawing from active care, the patient to be followed by Dr. Morales, a friendly nurse who gave Sophie a warm, clinical smile and said, "We'll take good care of you," like a benediction. Sophie felt a shift that felt like air moving through a previously closed room. It wasn't that everything was suddenly clear. It was that, for the first time in a long time, someone had acknowledged both her need for care and her capacity to refuse being a patient in someone's personal life without consent. Daniel had crossed the line. He had not erased that. He had, however, tried to do the ethical thing afterward. "Why tell me all this now?" Sophie asked later, when the room had grown quieter and the nurse had left. The question was soft, made of curiosity and a cautious hope. "Because I don't want you to discover later that I was dishonest about my intentions," he said. "Because if I'm going to be in your life in any way, I want it to be because you chose it, without any pressure, without any sense of obligation." The honesty in his voice cut through the fog that had been gathering in Sophie's chest for years. It was an offering, balanced and not presumptive. They sat with that for a few minutes, the two of them on opposite sides of an ethical seam. Sophie thought of the man at the dinner table who had said, "It's okay," and how the phrase had been a door slammed with compassion masquerading as generosity. She thought of all the small kindnesses that carried strings. She thought of the ways in which love had been conditional in her past, contingent upon what she could give, to whom, and at what cost. "Will you leave now?" she asked, absurdly formal, like an invitation to court. He considered her face. There was a gentleness in his gaze that suggested he wanted to fix things as much as he wanted to be close. "I'll leave if you want me to," he said. "I can step out and we can let the transfer happen without any pressure. Or I can stay, only if you say it's okay. Either way, I'll respect whatever boundary you set." She thought of all the time she'd been respected in ways that meant being pitied. This was different. There was no performance, no moral grandstanding. It was a man who had made a mistake and was trying to make it right without making himself the center of the narrative. "Leave," she said finally, testing it. "But leave a note, or a book, something ordinary." He gave a small, almost disbelieving smile. "A book," he said, as if the suggestion delighted him even more than it did her. He opened his palm, and, as if conjured from somewhere mundane and comforting, he pulled a small volume from his coat pocket, a battered copy of a poetry chapbook she had once placed in the shop window and joked about as an item for people who needed a shorter night of reading. He set it on the bedside table like an offering, and stood. Before opening the door, he turned back to her. "You're not a condition," he said, and the words landed in the room with a soft thud. They were simple and not an answer to everything. They were, however, a declaration. Sophie felt the sentence unpack inside her in ways she wasn't ready to name. It was not the end of the story. It was a small seam that might, with time and care, allow something else to begin. But there was also dread, because trust is built in increments, and each increment requires risk. He left, and the hallway swallowed his silhouette. The door closed on his figure like a punctuation mark. Outside, the world moved on. The beep of machines, the soft shuffle of shoes. She held the chapbook to her chest like a talisman designed for a smaller life. The transfer was formalized the next day. Dr. Morales came to introduce herself. A quieter woman with a steady kindness that felt like a warm, unnecessary blanket. She explained, in plain language, what the clinic's plans were without hovering over Sophie or making her feel like a case file. Daniel's note in the chart was clinical, and yet threaded through it was a line he'd written with careful honesty. Patient informed of transfer. I have resigned active care to avoid conflict. It was administrative and, for Sophie, oddly sacred. A document that made the crossing visible and the remedy transparent. That transparency mattered more than she expected. It let her make decisions without wondering what hidden currents pulled the strings. It took the mystery out of Daniel's presence and made it a choice he would have to make without institutional advantage. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt a clarity she had not deliberately courted before. Agency. Days passed into weeks. The bookstore resumed its steady hum. Sophie worked and shelved and wrapped paperbacks in brown craft paper for patrons who liked their books gift-wrapped. She read the chapbook in stolen intervals, the physical weight of it a comfort like a tiny stone in her pocket. She and Daniel ran into each other with a new kind of awkwardness that came from meeting after the institutional seam had been sewn. He asked about her work. She asked about his foundation's latest community initiative. The interactions were cautious, sometimes clumsy, but increasingly honest. One late afternoon in the cafe across from the river, they shared a table over mismatched mugs. The light slid across Daniel's jaw and softened the air into something more forgiving. He listened when she spoke about trivial things, the way the shop smelled after rain, the pop song that made her bellyache with nostalgia. And when she spoke about deeper things, he was present without attempting to fix them. He asked, plainly, about boundaries, about how she felt regarding their overlap. He said, I wanted to be here because I was worried. I was wrong to blur lines. I'm trying to do it right now. Sophie accepted his admission with small increments of trust. She was not cured of the ache of rejection. But she felt something shift. Choices that used to be delivered to her like verdicts were now placed on a table for her to select. The difference was subtle and belonged to the slow, steady work of a life reclaimed. Not everything smoothed at once. Some days she felt raw with indignation, an ancient and domestic sorrow that was not comfortable company. Other days, the world felt possible in soft hues. Daniel did not erase the past. No single gesture could. What he offered instead was months of careful proximity, a willingness to be present without leveraging his position to claim her. He did not buy her a life. He made room in his. When, one evening months later, he took both her hands in his over a cup of coffee in the very cafe where they'd both been quiet strangers once, Sophie felt the smallness of her old vow, the one that said she would never let anyone choose her. He looked at her with a gravity she had not expected. I crossed a line, he said again, as if confession was a map and this moment a step along it. I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you to see that I tried to fix it and that I'm still trying. I want to be in your life by your terms. Sophie inhaled. She could feel the months in her body, the small, accumulating evidence that she could be liked without being pitied. She could feel how the bookstore had steadied her, how the chopbook had become something she turned to like a hinge. Choosing Daniel now would not be curing anything. It would be adding a person to a life she was slowly reclaiming for herself. The decision felt enormous, yet intimate, like stepping into a boat she was steering. She smiled. Not fully yet, but enough. "I'm not ready to be chosen for reasons other than me," she said, honest and unadorned. "You never have to be," he replied. "That's the only way I would want it." They sat in the glow of the cafe and let their hands linger. Outside, the city kept going, oblivious to the particular and fragile thing that hummed between them. It would be naive to say the rest was simple. It would be dishonest to claim that a line had not been crossed. But the breach had been named, and a rigorous attempt at repair had begun. Sophie could feel the care as a kind of scaffolding. It didn't make her past vanish. It gave her a chance to build differently. A month later, an envelope arrived at the shop addressed to Sophie with a neat, clinical hand. Inside was a short letter from Dr. Hayes, a note of apology, and a line reminding her that all decisions were hers. There was nothing grand, no declarative promises, no dramatic flourish, just a sentence that acknowledged complexity and stepped away from ownership. She folded the letter and placed it in the shop's suggestion box for reasons that surprised her. A public, small marker that she had been seen and had chosen. Evening settled softly. Sophie stood by the window of the bookstore and watched the streetlights come on like punctuation marks. She thought back to the night she had collapsed and how it had felt like the end of something. Instead, it had been the seam of a beginning, uneasy and imperfect. Daniel had crossed an ethical line by staying at her bedside, but he had also opened the possibility of repair by removing his authority and asking for consent. That was not a fairy tale. It was an adult transaction of trust. When she closed up the shop that night, she noticed a small, familiar cup on the counter, with a stain like a thumbprint at the rim. He had left it there once before, the kind of insignificant detail that made up a person's presence. She touched it with a fingertip and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with a man who had made his mistake visible and then tried to rectify it. Sophie did not yet know whether she would walk across the room and call him. She did not yet know whether she would let herself be chosen on the terms he offered. But she was ready to consider the possibility, and that, for someone who had been rejected for reasons no one else could explain, was its own small kind of revolution. If this story pulls at something in you, a rusty hinge, a quiet hope, follow for more stories that care about people who are learning how to be chosen, not pitied. That night, Sophie did not call. She folded the chapbook into the pocket of her cardigan and let the pages press against her hip like a secret. She slept badly, waking to the sound of a delivery truck rolling past the shop and a custody of dreams that felt unfinished. In the morning, the city seemed softer for reasons she couldn't name. She told herself that was good enough. Weeks threaded into one another with an economy of small gestures. Daniel kept his promise to remain off her clinical records. His name faded from the paperwork and later reappeared only in a passing credit for a donation to a literacy program Sophie had once recommended at the bookstore. Their overlaps became intentional and mutual. A shared table at the cafe across from the river, a conversation about an obscure poet she liked, an argument about whether used bookstores should accept every donation they were offered. It felt like a choreography learned in private, two people finding a rhythm after the awkwardness of an exposed seam. Sophie, who had spent years shrinking, surprised herself by beginning to assert preferences she'd learned to swallow. When Daniel invited her to one of his foundation's fundraising mixers, she said no, at first, because she was not ready to be presented like an emblem of his good deeds. He accepted that without drama and without explanation. Weeks later, he invited her again, but this time on different terms. "Come if you want to see the reading program in action," he said, "not as my guest, as yourself." She went. Daniel's fingers brushed the back of her hand in an absent, familiar way. He did not move quickly toward her. He leaned in by inches until their foreheads touched. The kiss that followed was brief and unperformative, a punctuation more than a flourish. When they parted, there was gentleness in his eyes and an unspoken question. Was she willing to continue? She was. Not because he'd rescued her, not because he had power to do so, but because months of careful, unspectacular choice had accumulated into trust. She said yes with a small nod, and they continued sorting books as if nothing monumental had happened. That ordinariness, love as a continuation of small things, fit her like a glove. There were obstacles that had nothing to do with Daniel's sincerity. Friends who had known Sophie before her illness asked intrusive questions about how things could possibly work. Colleagues at the bookstore speculated in halting, sometimes sympathetic tones. Sophie learned to answer their curiosity with the same tact she used in arranging display copies. Choose carefully what to show and what to keep private. She taught Daniel how to be present in the margins of her life without making it all about him. He, in turn, learned how to sit in silence when she needed to speak and to keep his voice steady when the world offered them commentary. One winter evening, on the cusp of the year turning, Sophie found herself restless in a way she hadn't been for years. Restless not with fear, but with an energy that wanted to test the new ground between them. They sat in the cafe where they'd shared their first real conversation after the transfer, a mug between them sending thin ribbons of steam into the cool air. Outside, the river glittered, and a busker played a melody that was more memory than song. Daniel, who had been handling news from the foundation all morning, had pockets of fatigue drawn into the corners of his mouth. "I want to ask you something," he said, and even the way he said it, tentative and deliberate, felt like another repair. Sophie looked up. The memory of the night she had collapsed flickered like a film in the back of her mind, a reminder of how far she had come and how much of her past lived placidly under the surface. "Okay," she said. He reached across the table and folded his hands over hers, fingers warm and sure. "I know I crossed a line, more than once in my head if not in action, and I know I asked you to trust me with something that could make you feel indebted. I don't want any of that to be the foundation of something between us." She let the sentence settle. "I'm not asking for anything fast," he continued. "I'm asking if you would consider, when you're ready, starting something with me. No titles, no spectacles, just dates, small ones, bookstore shifts you don't have to work, walks with no agenda, a promise I'll never make a decision for you without asking." Sophie looked at him and felt the months they'd shared refract through that moment. The transfer, the careful attendance at public events, the times he'd answered her when she'd been angry and not charming. She felt how she had learned to place boundaries into sentences and see if they were honored. "What will you do if I say yes?" she asked, because she needed the map in plain words. He smiled in that tired way that had become familiar to her. "I will continue to remove my professional footprint," he said. "I will let you lead. I will try every day to remember you are a person, not a problem to be solved. I'll learn to be smaller when you ask me to. And when I fail, I will apologize and do better." She thought of all the apologies life had required of other people, ones that came wrapped in excuses and followed by a performance designed to soothe the offended. What she heard in him now was not a plea for absolution, but a steady intent. "And if I say no?" she asked. "Then I'll respect it," he said. "I'll step back and I'll still do right by you as a person." Sophie let the question hang, not because the answer was uncertain, but because she wanted the act of choosing to feel weighty and considered. She reached for his hand and squeezed, not to accept, but to consider. "I'm tired of being chosen for what I bring," she said finally, "and I don't want to be chosen because it's easy for you or because it's charitable. I want to be chosen because of me." "You already are," he said, low and immediate. She accepted the slow dates that followed. An exhibition of local artists, a walk along the Winter River where they argued about the ethics of donations to public libraries, a quiet Sunday where they both tried a recipe neither of them expected to like and laughed at the result. At each juncture, Sophie evaluated the texture of his attention, present, not performative, curious, not possessive. These were the qualities that rebuilt trust. Months later, on an afternoon that had the brittle clarity of early spring, Daniel asked for a larger conversation. They were, as they often were, at the cafe near the river. The light through the windows had a greenish cast, and the sound of a stroller was like punctuation. Daniel seemed a little more composed than usual. He had the look of someone who had rehearsed silence and decided to be sincere anyway. "Sophie," he began, his hand finding hers across the table, "I want to ask you something that sounds like it belongs in a different story, one with roses and ribbons. But it's not that. It's me asking in plain language if you would marry me." She blinked. Behind the surprise there was a cool logic. Months that had included a transfer of care, months spent building a relationship that honored boundaries, months in which she had chosen him over and over. The path to this moment had been deliberate. It had not been the result of a single intrusion or gesture. "I don't know how to do this," she said at first, because that was the honest response. "I don't know how to answer in a way that feels like it's enough for what you've asked." "You don't have to answer right now," he said. "But when you do, know that I'm not asking you because I want to fix anything. I'm asking because, after all the ways I could have been thoughtless, I want to spend my life trying not to be." Sophie thought of the man at the dinner table who had once offered the softest of rejections. She thought of the hospital fluorescent lights, of a folder closed and then opened again under different terms. She thought of every step that had been taken to make this request fair. His resignation of clinical authority, the months of being present on her terms, his learning to step back when she needed him to. She heard, beneath his words, the echo of a promise that had been constructed like a small house, shelter built one careful plank at a time. "Will you give me time?" she asked. "I will give you however long you need," he said. She laughed then, a short, surprised sound that had nothing to do with previous fear. "So this is not a proposal that comes with a deadline," she said. "No deadlines," he agreed. "Only coffee dates and the occasional bad movie." They both laughed at that, and in the laugh something else shifted. An acceptance so plain it almost disguised itself as ordinary contentment. 3 weeks later, after nights of walking and thinking and speaking to the close friends who had earned a say in her life, Sophie called him. They met at twilight in the cafe where rain made the river look like ink in a pen. She sat down, cupped her mug, and said, "Yes." It was not an instantaneous, breathless collapse into a romance novel's climax. It was a decision made with the gravity of someone who had chosen before and had learned the cost of passive acceptance. She was not saying yes to erase her past. She was saying yes to a person who had been willing to be accountable for the crossing of a line and to be reshaped by that admission. She was saying yes to months of small, consistent choices. She was saying yes to being chosen by someone who asked repeatedly for consent. The proposal that had lived in his pocket for evenings became finally an unadorned question under a dim light. There were rings, 2 small bands that fit like promises without vanity, and a short toast with the bookstore staff who had become conspirators in quiet ways. The announcement was not a spectacle. It was whispered among mismatched mugs and the rustle of pages. Friends hugged, a few people cried, in a way that felt respectful rather than performative. Later, alone in their apartment that looked like a cross between a library and a life in progress, Sophie turned the thing over in her hands. The band she wore was not a cure or a certificate of belonging. It was a symbol, like a book spine, of a story they had decided to write together. She thought of the title that had once felt like a verdict, rejected for her condition. She had lost hope. Then she thought of how fragile and sure it felt to be chosen after boundaries had been set straight and respect had been earned. There were no tidy endings. There were audit meetings with the foundation about optics and consent, small conversations with friends who needed reassurance that nothing about Sophie's autonomy had been compromised, and the occasional old worry that returned like a draft at the window. But those were part of the work of intertwining two lives that had not always lived in the same language. They learned to keep conversations open and to check in about how each name and choice landed. Daniel learned more and more to be small when he needed to be, to keep his public life from swallowing Sophie's personal narrative. Sophie learned that vulnerability could be a choice and not a sentence. Years later, standing in the same cafe where they had shared 1,000 small moments, Sophie watched a young woman close to her age sit at a nearby table and take off the scarf from her neck with hands that trembled slightly. For a second, Sophie recognized the old shapes of fear and the instinct to shrink. The woman caught her eye and offered a tentative smile, one that asked without forcing conversation. Sophie remembered the nights she had felt like packing herself away. She walked over and, with no fanfare, offered a small recommendation from a shelf behind the counter, a slim collection of poems that had helped her through a difficult season. The young woman took it with a gratitude that was both awkward and luminous. Sophie sat opposite her and, as if by chance, opened a conversation that was less about heroic rescue and more about the mundane kindness of listening. Later, when Daniel joined her with the mugs, he took her hand under the table and squeezed. They did not need to speak about the long ethical seam they had crossed and mended. It lived in their gestures, the way he asked for consent, the way she reminded him he had to be smaller sometimes, the way they both had learned to choose each other without erasing the dense geography of what had occurred before. In the end, Sophie's life did not become a different plotline because of a man with resources. It became fuller because the man had chosen to be accountable, to remove professional advantage, and to learn how to love someone as an equal. The city outside the cafe hummed with its usual indifference, and that was fine. Inside the small room, two people who had once been strangers and then a breach and finally collaborators in one another's healing chose each other again and again, not because the crossing of the line had been romanticized, but because it had been acknowledged and repaired. She had been rejected for her condition and had once believed hope was a thing that could snap like a brittle spine. Now she understood hope as something patient and deliberate, a series of small decisions, a promise to listen, a refusal to be anyone's charity. He had crossed the line, and because he had done the hard thing, confessed, transferred, given time, she could accept him not as an answer, but as a companion in a life she still owned. If Sophie's story has touched you, if the shape of careful repair and choice matters, please like and subscribe for more stories about people learning to be chosen on their own terms.